If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke chapter 14. This is where we'll be spending our time today. Jesus is in another one of these mixed gatherings where he's holding forth and doing things. It's a Sabbath day. And in this crowd are Pharisees, scribes, Herodians, lawyers, people who were very, very familiar with the law. And they're following Jesus around. And they're not following him around because they enjoy listening to him. They're following him around because they're trying to catch him out in something that he would say or do that would allow them then to go before the Sanhedrin, that is the Jewish court, accuse Jesus and have him arrested. So let's take a look at this text and see what it would say about this. Verse 1 of chapter 14. One Sabbath when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man who suffered from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But the Pharisees and the lawyers remained silent. So taking hold of the man with the dropsy, Jesus healed him and sent him away. Then Jesus asked the lawyers and the Pharisees, "If one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well, will you not immediately pull him out?" And they had nothing to say to Jesus. This man in this crowd is suffering from edema. That is, you all know what edema is, most of us. It's where fluid, because of either a heart condition or a kidney condition or both, collects in the lower extremities of one's body. And at this time in history, there was no cure for this. There was no way to even treat it. So if you had it, you're stuck with it until it just takes you out. And it's odd to me, when you think about it, that this man should suddenly appear in this crowd like this. In Jewish tradition, if you had a meal in your home, especially if you were of the Jewish officialdom, it was just understood that anybody who wanted to come to your house during that meal was allowed to come, and they were to be served food. That was just the way Jewish hospitality worked. But the fact that this man with dropsy is here on this day says a lot. First of all, this guy wouldn't just be wandering around Jerusalem. That wouldn't happen. So the fact that he's there lets us know that this is not an accident that he's there. These Pharisees have brought him there. Think of the cruelty of something like that. That you would take a person who's suffering from something who's very unfortunate in that time in history, and you would use them to make a point. And that's exactly what's going on here. It happened in Luke chapter 6 the same way. They brought a man in front of Jesus on a Sabbath day with a withered hand so that he would be right in front of Jesus and be seen. And this way Jesus would be coerced because of his compassion to do something that they deemed unlawful on the Sabbath, which was to do the work of healing the man. And this is exactly the same. There are 7 occasions in the 4 Gospels where Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, and this is one of those. Now the common people loved Jesus because of this. There was none of this. They had no difficulty with the fact of the Sabbath because most of the common people couldn't keep the law very well anyway. They all had jobs. But if your job is to keep the law, well then of course you're very good at it. And the Sadducees, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the lawyers were very good at keeping the law because that's how they made their living, by the temple tax. But the common people couldn't do that. And so they were happy when Jesus did this stuff because that appealed to them. They could not necessarily always keep the Sabbath laws. And Jesus came and told them something brand new. He said, "You're not made for the law was made for you. The Sabbath, you're not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given to you as a gift." That's revolutionary for these people. For them this is the happiest news they could have gotten at that time in history. But Jesus is here, and these Pharisees and scribes and lawyers are not interested in this at all. In fact, they've done this whole orchestration just to get Jesus to do something they deem illegal so that they can go to the Sanhedrin, accuse Jesus, and have him arrested. Imagine having to work under that kind of scrutiny all the time. You're not just the scrutiny of people watching you. I can tell you all, because you're kind of my friends, it's hard. I'm not comfortable up here ever in front of people. I never have been. That's kind of scrutiny, right? Everybody's eyeballs are fixed on me right now, so I'm under some scrutiny. I have to hope that you don't get that white stuff around the corners of your mouth, or you don't accidentally expectorate while you're speaking. I used to travel with a guy that nobody would sit in the first couple of rows because he spit so much when he talked. I mean, people who travel with him, we just knew you stay back a good distance unless you want to be wet. So the scrutiny, though, that Jesus is under is one that's life-threatening. I remember when I first moved to Pennsylvania, the first band I traveled with, just to give you a picture of what this is like. I think everybody can relate to that in some way. But I went to work for a contractor there in Pennsylvania who allowed me to work whenever we were off the road. We were out about 125, 150 days a year, and when I would come off the road, which sometimes would be 3 months, I'd leave in the summer and come back and it'd be cold. And he would just put me right back to work. So I'd come off the road, and it was a Monday morning. I was out there working, and he had hired some people. And it was a guy out there who's about 40, I'm guessing, years old. And we had to put together bricklaying scaffold. Everybody knows what that is, right? The big pipe scaffold. You got 2 sets, and you got an X brace that goes between them, and you set boards on them, and it allows you to reach stuff up high. We were siding a house. So this new employee is putting the scaffolds together, and I'm just minding my business. I don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden I hear all this racket, and I turn around, and the guy that was putting the scaffold together has thrown them all on the ground. And he's walking across the yard, and the contractor's following him, and with his hands in the air. And I can tell there's a conversation going on that's probably kind of terse. And I walked over a little nearer so I could hear what they were saying. And the contractor says, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And the guy turned around. The contractor had been standing there while this man was putting together the scaffolding with his hands on his hips, just staring at him. And the guy turned around, got his tool belt, and said, "You're making me nervous," and got in his car and left. I never saw him again. He couldn't withstand that scrutiny like that. Now, Jesus uses an illustration here with the Pharisees on this day, and he says, look, how many of you, if you've got an animal and they fall into a well, or your son or daughter falls into a well, you wouldn't pull them out on the Sabbath? You have to understand that this time in history, a well was just a hole. Underneath it might be a cistern, or there might be a spring, but it wasn't like the pictures we see or the wells that we might have where you got a masonry wall around it and you got the trapeze with the pulley and the bucket and all that. It wasn't like that. It was just a hole. And so this was a common occurrence that animals, especially at night, would just step into one of these things and become trapped. The holes sometimes weren't any bigger than this. Animal falls in, gets both legs, they can't get out, and that's where they're stuck. And so Jesus says, surely, and Jesus knew the law. He knew the law allowed you to pull the animal or your child out of the hole. He knew that. But isn't it interesting that he would make this analogy with the Pharisees on that day? Because he knew they weren't going to answer it. Because he knew that then the crowd would know the Pharisees cared more about the law or an animal than they cared about the people. And so he had fully embarrassed them. The text reads, it uses a funny word here that has to do with the fact that Jesus overpowered the lawyers with his argument. So if they'd responded, everybody would have known just what kind of characters these guys were. They cared way more about their law than they did about any of the people. Now, this meal itself is a difficult thing. If you lived in Palestine and you were a Jew, you could not cook after sundown the day before the Sabbath because cooking was work. All right, so all your food for the next day has to be prepared. There's no refrigerator, there's no microwave. What are you going to do? What they would do is they'd take an urn, and it was buried inside the house or outside the house somewhere. It had a cover. It was a clay urn, and they would take all the food and prepare it, and they'd place it down inside this urn covered with sand, and it would keep it fit to eat for the next day, the Sabbath day. So all this is going on in this moment where Jesus is at this Pharisee's house to eat lunch. But you know, when I look at these guys, I think to myself, what's wrong with these people? What is wrong with the lawyers and the Pharisees and the scribes. What in the world could motivate them to want to have Jesus arrested for healing somebody? It just makes no sense, does it? There's a historical element here that helps it to make a lot of sense. If you get home today and you feel frisky, grab your Bible and just read Deuteronomy chapter 28 from top to bottom. What you'll see is about the first third of it's nice stuff. And it's God speaking through Moses saying, if you will obey me, here's all the nice stuff that's going to happen. The second two-thirds of it is all the bad stuff that's going to come if you don't obey. All right? These Pharisees, the Pharisees are a unique group of people. Did you know they're only 200 years old by this time in history? There were no Pharisees. You go back through your Old Testament, you will not find the word Pharisee any place. The group of people known as the Pharisees did not appear until the 200s BC, 200 years after the close of the Old Testament. They were the freedom fighters that fought against the Greco-Roman armies and generals that were subjugating the Jews. The Greco-Roman general who desecrated the temple, and the Maccabean period, when John Maccabee set the temple free. The Pharisees are the group of people who were the freedom fighters during that period. All right? 200 years for you and me is a long time, but for them it's nothing. History never dies in the Middle East. The Semitic people hold on to history forever. They're looking back at that time in history as a time in which God was judging the Jewish nation by these Greco-Roman generals. And they're looking at Jesus, and they're seeing him do what they believe to be against the Jewish law. And they're saying to themselves, we've read Deuteronomy 28 in our Torah, and we don't want God to judge us again like that. And they're looking at Jesus and saying, Jesus could very well bring this kind of judgment on us. And so they're trying to catch him out. They're trying to solve what they see as a problem. I have sympathy for that. The problem is, this is where this funnels down to you and to me. We can come to a place in our lives where those things that we are, like we talked about last week, I just am the way I am, that's just a death sentence for any human being to say that. I am the way I am? No. God has something to say about that. But the Pharisees had come to the place in their lives where they were so caught in their view of what was proper as Jewish living that God himself could show up and they couldn't see him. They couldn't see it. They were so inflexible that God couldn't penetrate the shell and make them see anything any differently. They were in what I would call cruise control. I remember when I was working in Waycross, I was 19 or 20 years old, and I was working for a contractor in town. And the favorite part of the day, when you work in construction, Al can speak to this, or anybody else who's worked on a gig like that. When 12 o'clock comes, you know about 15 minutes before 12, it's 12 o'clock. You don't have to have a watch. Your stomach will tell you it's time for lunch. You just know. And at lunch, our favorite thing to do was eat and then listen to Paul Harvey at lunchtime on the radio. Stand by for news. And Paul, on this particular day, he always closed the news report out with a funny story or a nice story, something uplifting. On this particular day, he talked about a ex-military guy who had bought a conversion van in California. And he'd had it tricked out with everything you could have. He had a refrigerator and a stove, and he had a table in the back and a place to sleep, and everything you could want in this van. So he took it out in California, got on California 5. And then he got off California 5 and went down some of the country roads, just driving around. This is back in the 70s when gas was, at that time, 25 cents a gallon. You didn't care how much of it you burned. So he's just riding around. And then a few hours later, the State Patrol, CHIPS, California Highway State Patrol, got a phone call saying there's been a wreck. You need to go check it out. They gave him the mile marker, and you have to realize there were no cell phones back then, so this was a big deal that somebody would take the trouble to call them up. The State Patrol goes to where the wreck was supposed to be, and sure enough, in the scrub, there was a kind of ravine, and in the scrub brush, there was a cutout in the shape of a van. I mean, it was a rectangle cut out in the scrub, and at the end of the tunnel, there was the van. And it was so encased in the scrub brush that you couldn't get to any of the doors but the two on the back. So they went up to it and knocked on the door. And sure enough, a guy opens the door and leans out, and the state patrolman says, "Are you all right?" He says, "Yeah." He said, "What happened?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I got into my van. I just wanted to check out my new conversion van. I was driving around." And he said, "All of a sudden I realized I was kind of thirsty, so I turned the cruise control on and went to the back to have something to drink." That's what the Pharisees were like. They were just in cruise control with the law, and they couldn't see their way out of it. Remember, there used to be a bumper sticker that said, and this is in the 80s, I remember it, "God is my co-pilot." You remember that bumper sticker? That's crazy. He's either the pilot or he's not. He can't be the co-pilot. When I was in Pennsylvania, one of our jobs as the pastoral team, there were about 12 of us, we would be assigned people. You were assigned a person or a family, and if there were difficulties, you were to work with that family. And I got assigned two different families. One of them was a family wherein the couple had 3 children and one of them had died. And the child's death was tragic. She was working in the house, he was at work, and they had an in-ground swimming pool in the backyard, and she was busy at the sink. She looked up and she saw her son floating in the water. She went out there, they couldn't revive him, and they lost him. Can you imagine how that would feel? Not just the loss, but also the way in which that child was lost. Well, it really did terrible things to their marriage. And so I was assigned to him. And someone else was, a woman elder was assigned to his wife. When I got that assignment, I said, "Let's meet for breakfast every Tuesday at a certain place at 5:30 in the morning." And so we did. He was always there. He was there sometimes even before me. If he couldn't show up, I got a phone call the night before, and we rescheduled for a different day. And everything that we talked about in that meeting, he went home and did. And his wife was doing the same thing. And God saved their marriage. They stayed married happily for the rest of their lives until here in the last 2 years he died. Then I met with another guy. Same problem, marital difficulties, different circumstance, but marital difficulties. And so I started to meet with him. First couple of times, here he is, we're sitting there, we have breakfast, same arrangement. Then a few times later, all of a sudden he's 10 minutes late. Then he's 20 minutes late. Then he's blasting through the restaurant doors with leaves and dust coming in behind him. And it always was an excuse as to why he couldn't be there when he was supposed to be there. And the excuses were always legitimate. I left something at home or something like that, or the dog had to be let out. Or I'm thinking, if a person is late once and mostly on time, fine. But if it's chronic like that, the problem is not the stuff, it's the person. And he didn't do any of the things, nor did his wife. His wife actually lived with Becky and me for months while this was all happening. He didn't do any of the things. And it was obvious to me by the fact that he wasn't participating in this meeting that he wasn't going to do those things. Why? He was locked into who he was, and he wasn't going to be changed. Something has to break that pattern. We have to come to a place, and this is where I see the Pharisees in parallel with some of us. All of us have things in our lives that we'd like to be rid of, right? Something in our personality, something in the way we are. We use that language. This is just how I am what I am, like Popeye. And the pain of change has to be exceeded by the pain of where we are, or we will not change. It has to become more painful to stay as we are, or we will not change. Because sometimes change is painful. Think about Jonah. God ramped up the misery meter. Jonah did not like the Assyrians. He did not want to go to Nineveh. And so God said, okay, let me help you a little bit here. Sent the fish. 3 nights in a fish. Jonah suddenly came to the realization that, yeah, I think I can do this now. But God had to do something in order to get Jonah to think differently about the Assyrians and about himself. When we say, I am the way I am, that is absolutely a death sentence for anybody. If there's something going on in our lives, either relationally or in terms of employment or in terms of our relationship with God, in terms of our relationships even within ourselves, and we say that, I am the way I am, it's over. God can't penetrate that shell. But He might turn the misery meter up just a little bit to help us come to a place where the pain of where we are becomes less than the pain of change. He might do that. And it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It looks bad because it hurts sometimes. But it's God in His incredible mercy. He knows that this life is only a short time. He knows that. And He knows that He can take a portion of that short time and use it to change us, to make us more of who we ought to be. You know, you take a chunk of clay, you can make an ashtray, you can fire it into that shape, or you can make a sculpture. You can make a toilet. You know, a toilet's just a big piece of fired clay. Or you can make a piece of fine china with it. And God wants us to be fine china. He wants every person in this room, myself, He wants the whole of the earth to flourish and to be exactly as He has us to be. But He is not going to break down the gates of our will in order to make us do what we don't want to do. These Pharisees were like that. The pain of being different, the pain of being open to God was far greater for them than the pain of who they were. And being trapped in the law as they were content to stay that way. God says through the prophet Ezekiel, I'll give them one heart. I'll take their spirit and put my spirit in them. I'll take the stony heart of their flesh out, and I'll put a soft heart of flesh within them. It's painful sometimes, but it's not that severe, because the outcome is always better. Anytime we're willing to be changed by God, it's always going to be better for us. Always. The question always is, you know, we come to church, we read our Bibles, maybe we're engaged really heavily in the disciplines of walking with Jesus, but the pain of change just looks too hard for us, and we're not willing. And we're caught in those same ruts that we just continue to live in year after year because the pain of change looks to be greater than whatever it is we're facing by living in the ruts. I don't know what it is. You know what it is for your own life. I know what it is for mine sometimes. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, think of it this way. It seems to me that they were more fearful of being seen to be less than complete followers of Yahweh than it would be to really be a follower of Yahweh. In other words, I don't want anybody, none of us in this room wants to be embarrassed. None of us in this room wants to see ourselves opened up before God in a public setting because it's embarrassing. We want people around us to think of us as good followers of Jesus, no matter what we're going through, no matter how we feel. We don't want to be seen to be less than. The Pharisees, the scribes, the lawyers did not want the other Jewish people to see them as anything but the leaders of Israel. And they knew that if they surrendered to God in this way, if they allowed God to change them, it might be that they'd be seen to be less than they were. Now I just want to ask us the question today for all of us to think about. Is the fear of not being seen to be close to God so great that we're really not able to be close to Him at all? I don't know where everybody is, but God's got better stuff for us than that. If there's anything about this sermon or anything that's happened today, anything